author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're just 1 year away from election 2024. What's the zeitgeist in the United States, and what's happening with the growing field of candidates? We'll be discussing this. We'll also be discussing government agencies acting as judge, jury, and executioner, and what the Supreme Court is, if anything, going to do about it. Plus, we'll have a civics lesson from Miss Monica Lewinsky. All this and more on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com. You can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's get started. With less than 1 year to go until what many pundits are describing as the most fateful election of our lifetimes, it's worth examining the zeitgeist and see what issues are taking center stage. Now, we're very lucky to have with us a very keen political mind, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donahue, who joins us once again. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Oh, always a pleasure, Mark.
So, Tim, you and I, we're pretty excited. It's just over 11 months out from the election. But for us, that's passing in a fleeting moment, because we're examining the numbers on a almost daily basis, I guess, especially. And
I would say semi-daily basis, or twice daily basis. Probably in the morning and the evening. Yes, it is. It's like Super Bowl season beginning for political junkies. An election in 2024 that not only promises a rematch that nobody wants, but probably four other additional independent or third-party candidates, the effect of which is impossible to dictate at this point. It's impossible to figure out what the effect of even a single Trump criminal indictment would be. It's impossible to figure out the carryover effect of abortion, which will appear on a presidential, ballot effectively for the first time since Roe versus Wade 50 years ago. It's impossible to gauge the ultimate effect of someone so old and feeble as Joe Biden running for president. We've never seen that before either. So you want to talk about a jump ball. This election appears to be, I don't know, Mark, maybe the best way to put it right now is a free-for-all, or maybe more of a parliamentary style election with multiple coalitions and alliances that need to be built in order for someone to be elected. I mean, it could be the kind of case, frankly, Mark, where it goes to the House of Representatives, because Robert F. Kennedy, potentially Joe Manchin, and then you've got Jill Stein and Cornel West, all of whom are likely to pull support in a race between two major party candidates that are broadly unpopular. So, boy, buckle your seatbelts. It's going to be a wild ride.
It's like Christmas has come early for us.
Yes, true.
Now, we will be later in the show, we'll be delving into those candidates. Specifically, I also want to talk about the candidate who has not and will not declare until the very last moment. And I think you know who I'm talking about there, Tim. And if you at home haven't figured out who I'm talking about, I'm sure you have. You're a clever bunch. And, of course, I'm sure very handsome and or beautiful. We'll be talking about that in the next segment, so don't go anywhere on that. But what I'd like to talk about just now, Tim, is the zeitgeist.
I just have to say, Mark, that when I was hosting the show, I didn't feel it necessary to butter up the listeners and viewers as you're doing now. But
well, you're American. They listen to you anyway. I'm English. I've got to earn my stripes here.
Go ahead.
All right. So I want to talk about the zeitgeist. What's really engaging voters, what voters are thinking about going into the election, because people are thinking about it now. The airwaves are filled with, I mean, you've heard Joe Scarborough's Morning Joe's recent diatribe against Donald Trump, saying that, you say he's not going to be like this past Nazi leader or this past fascist leader, but look at him. Look what he did. And it was just plain ridiculous. It was hyperbole to the nth degree. But it's everywhere. It's in the airways. But do people care about what the majority of the left-leaning media is saying about Donald Trump, or do they care more about the issues? For example,
that's the
economy.
single abiding question of this election, because the issues aren't, I think, even going to barely come into play, except for the record of Joe Biden and the record of Donald Trump, because now we can compare those two head to head. But look, Mark, they thought the left was fully convinced that January 6th and a full-blown Hollywood-style congressional hearing and, basically playing January 6th footage on a loop round the clock, nonstop, would be more than enough to stop Donald Trump from becoming president again, probably would stop him from even being able to run. But now they are, to say desperate is an overused word, but they really are, and they've started to flail about. I'll give you another example beyond Joe Scarborough. And the general talk in every left-wing publication, from the New York Times to Washington's most famous newspaper, and on, that Trump would basically initiate concentration camps for illegal immigrants. He would suspend the rule of law. He would terminate all civil service employees that were not loyal to a MAGA Pledge of Allegiance, for example. So what's happened is they see January 6th isn't enough, so they have to reinitiate a round of Trump as Hitler. But here's what they've done now. I think the one card that they didn't play last time that they're trying to play this time is that Claire McCaskill, the former senator from Missouri, brought this up. She said, in fact, Trump is even worse than Hitler and Mussolini because, and here we go, they're reimagining Adolf Hitler here. At least Hitler believed in something. Hitler believed what he said. Mussolini believed what he said. Trump, in fact, only believes in himself and doesn't have any beliefs, which makes him more dangerous than Hitler. This is what they've been reduced to as Biden slips further and further behind. The Democrats have played out every extreme argument against Donald Trump. They've tried to imprison him. They've tried to impeach him. They've indicted him 91 times. They've done everything they could. They've called him every name in the book. And I think the voters now can see, okay, how much of this is real and how much of it isn't. How much of it will cause me to vote for a guy in Joe Biden around whom we have lost the peace, lost the prosperity, crime has risen, the borders are open. It's a total, what it is, it's a dumpster fire, the Biden administration. And Donald Trump is simply profiting from that reality.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever seen a race with this many difference makers. Now, we will be discussing some of those particular difference makers when we come back after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with longtime host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we were talking about the zeitgeist, the situation with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But now I'd really like to dive into the other candidates, because it really is a conundrum about what kind of impact, what kind of factors they'll play on the voting margins and also the appearance margins, because, things are won and lost on how they look. Tim, thanks for coming back. Let's hear your take on the plethora of candidates that are available to the American public this election season.
Well, let's start with the most mysterious one, who is not an announced candidate yet, but everybody expects to announce next year, and that would be Joe
Clint Eastwood. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. No, Clint Eastwood will just give the nominating speech at the convention.
He's the new Charlton Heston.
2012, yes. But Joe Manchin is the big X factor, and I would say in an ordinary year as a third-party candidate, he would look very strong to possibly win a state or two, but certainly to affect the balance of the race. However, and the reason, by the way, is because he is seen as a true down-the-middle politician who rejects the extremes that too many voters see that the Democrats and Republicans have resorted to in their own rhetoric. Now, in an ordinary year, he would have a pretty clear field like a Ross Perot in 1992 as a third-party candidate.
18%, yeah.
But the problem is you've got right next to him Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has, in some polls, done so well that he, in fact, in a three-way race, hypothetical between RFK Jr., Trump, and Biden, RFK Jr. actually wins the votes of people under 45. So that's how, that's how effective his candidacy has been so far. And of course, he's got enormous name recognition. And then you've got another probably 3 to 5% that will be pulled by Jill Stein, who is the bane of Hillary Clinton's life. Hillary convinced that Jill Stein's votes in 2016 that would have gone to her lost her the election, and she may be right. And then you've got Cornel West, who will siphon off votes from the far left, the socialists, the cultural Marxists, the Ivy League academic types. So it's a very divided field, and I would argue that every one of those candidates, save one, will damage Joe Biden. But the one who I think it's up in the air who he will damage more is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because he has a very disparate sort of following, people all over the spectrum. You've got everyone from anti-vaxxers to peace activists to pro-Palestinian to pro-Israeli supporters. So I'd say Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the biggest X factor in a race, which is one huge X factor in some.
I would absolutely agree with your assessment, but I think that could very much change once the primary season's over. So once whoever's the Republican candidate, almost certainly Donald Trump, unless something of historical significance happens, and Joe Biden on the other side, unless something of a medical issue or historical significance.
I will say, Mark, there is one other candidacy that we tend to overlook. Sure. And that is in 1980, John Anderson, who was a liberal Republican, which is now a dinosaur. There aren't any, just like conservative Democrats. But John Anderson ran as a third-party candidate against Jimmy Carter, who was pictured as incompetent, and it proven so in the White House, and Ronald Reagan, who was depicted as a dangerous extremist who would start nuclear war. And John Anderson won 9% of the vote. Now, that did not affect that election because Reagan won a landslide, and he would have won huge with or without John Anderson. But in a race like this with two candidates who are so explosively controversial and a bunch of wild cards at a time where 40% of America represents themselves as independents, dwarfing both self-proclaimed Republicans and Democrats, who knows?
Yeah, although once they have declared the candidates for Republicans and Democrats, then I wonder how much of each other's fire will be aimed rather than at Biden and Trump, but at Robert F. Kennedy, because he certainly, as you point out, he certainly picks up the votes of those who who have put a lot of thought into vaccines, because he has really devoted much of his later career to that kind of thing, and also environmental issues. He'll also pick up that.
Yeah.
But by the same token, he's very much an open borders Democrat and pro-abortion, which I find.
Well, he's pro-abortion. I
Yeah.
don't think he's open borders anymore. He actually said he was open borders and supported Biden's policy, but then he went to the border and changed his mind.
He went to the border and met with his tactical team who'd seen the polling and changed his mind. Is perhaps, I mean, I wouldn't. He seems to me a very honorable guy, so I'm sure
he seems
if he says that he's
honest.
changed his mind.
He seems to me to be a very honest and serious candidate.
Speaking of serious candidates, we also haven't talked about Mr. Dean Phillips, have we?
Yes. And I think that he has, there's a tendency to just dismiss him as sort of a gadfly who's involved in some sort of vanity candidacy, but that's not really the case. Dean Phillips is a fairly new congressman from Minnesota who supported the Biden agenda, voted for almost everything that Biden brought forward, but kept saying over and over, Joe Biden cannot win a second term. He's too old, and somebody needs to challenge him. When nobody did, Dean Phillips said, okay, I'm going to challenge him, if only to make the point that we need somebody younger as the Democratic nominee. And so what he's done, though, by challenging Biden, is he's even magnified the biggest issue that Biden already has, which is his age, coming from within his own party, and at the same time weakened Joe Biden's general election campaign, because anytime a sitting president gets challenged in a primary, it weakens them for the general election. So Dean Phillips, too, is another guy who's serious.
Yeah.
He's not on an ego trip. He knows he's not going to win the nomination, but he's going to make the point. And it's even possible, Mark, that his candidacy, the fact that somebody decided to challenge Joe Biden, could open the floodgates for one or more others to do so. But they're running out of time.
The schedule's moving. And just a final word, Gavin Newsom, he's teasing everybody, isn't he? He's teasing everybody. Your final thoughts on Mr. Newsom?
Well, it's a good segue from Dean Phillips, because Dean Phillips has basically said, come on, Governor Newsom, you're running a shadow campaign. Why don't you just admit you're running for president? John Fetterman, the senator from Pennsylvania, said the same thing. We have three candidates in our party. One is Joe Biden, another is Dean Phillips, and the third is Gavin Newsom, but only two of them have declared their candidacy.
Well,
I think he said real.
I think he tangentially called him a coward as well for not declaring.
He did. Okay. So Dean Phillips has become the Democrat truth teller along with John Fetterman.
These are strange days indeed. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much.
Great fun, Mark. Thank you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The Supreme Court heard oral arguments on a case against the Securities and Exchange Commission that essentially accuses it and other government agencies as acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Now, is the accusation a stretch too far, or does it describe a specific set of legal circumstances that seek to evade constitutional responsibility? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Scott DeCosenza, who is a legal affairs editor of LibertyNation.com, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and who also happens to be a constitutional attorney. So if he gets things wrong, we blame him. Scott, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark.
Welcome to the Thunderdome once more. So, Scott, tell me about this case that's before the Supreme Court.
Yes, this SEC v. Jarkazy. The name is a little one I had to practice there. This was a man who started a hedge fund and was accused of fraud by the SEC and had to pay, or was ordered to pay over, or at about $1 million worth of fines and restitution and he challenged it because he said that they didn't bring him to court and say that he did this and give him a chance to defend himself. Instead, they just used an SEC in-house judge called an administrative law judge, or ALJ, to conduct the procedure, which was without a jury. And he said this violates a host of his constitutional protections, namely a Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial, and this is a civil matter, not a criminal one, and also that the independent federal courts, or Article III courts, which we would call them, need to be used by an agency, not their own in-house sort of, star chamber would be the defendant's way of putting it. Now, obviously, that's not the government's position, but.
Well, now, the reason this one's so interesting, Scott, and it's something that you and I discussed while discussing the title of your excellent article on this on libertynation.com. And yes, I still think my title was better. But it's that it's not just the SEC that has these in-house judges and therefore decides things. The agency is essentially acting as the judge and the jury and the executioner, as in dishing out the fines and or penalties.
The best reporting I've seen puts it at about 30 agencies that do this. Now, the SEC is a quote unquote independent agency, which is a bit interesting. What that, the president of the United States appoints every member of the SEC. It's designed so that there will be no one presidential term will appoint all of the commissioners because of their staggered terms. So the idea is that you did easily 2 terms in office to appoint the entire 5-member commission, and also only 3 of the members may be from the same party. So even if it's a Democrat, like Obama has 2 terms in office, he can not appoint a Democrat to 4 or 5 of the positions. Now, of course,
Scott, if I may interrupt here, Scott,
yeah, go ahead.
I think that point is largely irrelevant, isn't it, when it comes to the constitutional issues at hand, whether they're biased, whether they're unbiased or not. The fact is that people are being denied their 7th Amendment right here. And I think that's the big thing, isn't it? That's one
of the constitutional issues present, Mark. There are 3, but the court is
looking at. There's more.
Okay? Yeah. And one of those issues is the independence of the administrative law judges, who the courts have said get special protection because of the quote-unquote independent nature of the SEC. Unlike another department, they can't be dismissed without cause. They have a for-cause protection for their employment. And that has also been extended to the ALJ, or administrative law judges, not just in the SEC, but in all of the other federal agencies that use these sorts of things. And they've said this is not okay. The president has to be able to dismiss these people without cause.
Yeah.
Just like they would any other political appointee.
So the person under the hammer doesn't get a jury trial. The people who are deciding his fate are essentially unaccountable, as in it's near on impossible to fire them.
Let me just stop you there, Mark. I apologize for the interruption. They're accountable to their employers, the SEC. Who do you think they want to stay in good stead with, right?
Yeah,
that's part of the punishment.
And there's a third constitutional issue here as well, isn't there, Scott?
Well, the other constitutional issue has to do with whether or not the SEC has the power legally or constitutionally to bring these charges in their in-house courts rather than take them to federal court, which is how the sort of limited government liberty activists wish that the federal government, how they would proceed, which is to say that if somebody breaks a law or a regulation that is important enough to generate an enforcement action, that enforcement action be adjudicated by the independent federal courts that are supposed to stand between the government and the people as a bulwark of liberty and make sure that due process and norms within the law are followed, which, I'm smiling because you can imagine if you're the SEC judge working at the SEC, employed by the SEC, having lunch with all the people that are bringing you cases, at the SEC, and they're the ones you see every day. And then there's this other person who comes in who those people have said is a bad guy, a fraudster. Who are you likely to judge for? Well, the prejudice is baked into that system, and that's one of the other constitutional arguments, and which is why, Mark, this is such a huge case at the court for kind of like pro-government advocates versus limited government advocates, because all of those three things could be big deals if the court decides to rule on each of them in a way that is either beneficial or hostile to the position one holds.
It's a very emotive case, this, despite being about the SEC, which of course it is a monolith, right? It's a very emotive issue, because the idea that, you can have a trial by jury, which means that human beings with consciences will be considering what your situation is, what the facts of the matter are, and then you're being judged by a jury of your peers. But not here. You're being judged by an employee of the agency that is prosecuting you. Now, Scott, this seems like the people who talk about the deep state. I mean, I hate to go down that particular rabbit hole, but isn't this precisely their definition of a deep state agency?
If you look at the universe of people that have filed friend of the court or amicus briefs in this case, one of the ways to judge, the level of interest in the case is to just look at the sheer number of those. And this has been heavily briefed. And it is all sort of limited government advocates on one side and sort of big government advocates on the other. That's how it comes down. Those who argue for the rule of law and taming government want the government to be tamed by requiring the imposition of jury trials and the independent federal courts, rather than, you'll see these arguments, Mark, that it's, more efficient for the government. And it's like, nobody's arguing about efficiency. Of course it is, right? I mean, yeah.
The only way the government can ever be efficient is if it drags everything in-house and gets rid of your constitutional liberties.
Yeah. I don't think that any of the founders argued that maximum efficiency was their goal with
that's the goal, right?
Draftings. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously we don't have a ruling on this yet. Certainly not at the time of recording, probably not for quite a while the justices deliberate on this. But if they do decide that all three constitutional issues are a violation, I mean, this means that the entire, not just the SEC, but all the other up to 30 government agencies need to completely be redesigned from the ground up, doesn't it?
Well, their enforcement needs to be completely altered, and they need to then instead of like they did, and I'm searching once again for the gentleman's name, Mr. Jarksy. They would need to instead, for instance, so let's take Mr. Jarksy's case as an example. Instead of deciding to try that case in an SEC court, they would have had to have an SEC lawyer or the Department of Justice, through a referral, go to federal court and say, we want to initiate an action against this man in court. He would then have all the rights to a jury trial that, again, this would be a civil case. So it's not a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. It's a preponderance of the evidence standard. But they'd have to meet that before a jury, rather than just a judge, again, who is employed by the agency that he's being prosecuted by.
It seems as though this is a case that has been waiting to happen, Scott, in terms of freedoms and constitutional quandaries and conundrums. So we will be watching it closely, and Scott DeCosenza will be covering it on the pages of libertynation.com, or perhaps even on the Uprising podcast, which is always great, and I do recommend you listen to it wherever good podcasts are provided. Thanks very much, Scott.
Thank you for the plug, Mark. Always appreciated.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Miss Monica Lewinsky is back in the news, and no, before you ask, not for what made her famous in the first place, but now for being, I assume, a self-described activist and writer. And what's more, she has a civics lesson for us poor schlubs here in the real world who think that there are quite enough amendments to the US Constitution already. Now, we're joined once again by Mr. Scott DeCosenza to find out what she's asking for and why, at least in my opinion, it would entirely gut the present system of governments that we have already if her wishes were adhered to. Scott, please tell me, is Miss Lewinsky a legal mind and scholar of such nuance and insight that we should listen to what she's saying here?
To be clear, she's not, and I think this is an important part of the story, a self-described writer. She is, in fact, a writer published in the pages of the once important and venerated Vanity Fair magazine. That's
Is that still going? I wasn't aware.
It's not some tweet that, or she's not shouting down a manhole cover in some random street in America. This is the big establishment push to advance these ideas, at least in some part.
Okay, so these ideas, I mean, I think this is, I read it and I was kind of blown away by what she was suggesting. And I know that you find
Has she previously been considered somebody to rely on for guidance in establishing constitutions?
Well,
and
she has name recognition, which is important,
true.
which is why people like Monica Lewinsky are well listened to, and Chuck Schumer for his own reasons, I assume. So she was asking for 6 new amendments. Which ones leapt out at you, Scott? The thrust of her article was that
the biggest
there should be
one, Mark.
6 new amendments to the United States Constitution.
Yeah.
Which ones?
She's championing them. She's devoting herself to them.
And let's be clear, sorry, before we do go into this, she's championing them, but Vanity Fair is publishing her championing them, which means that there is almost certainly some kind of active media movement behind the ideas which they are allowing her to publish in their pages. So let's make that clear. This is not just one individual of fleeting fame for Oval Office activities decades ago. This is an idea.
We presume that this is messaging.
Yes, this is messaging.
That the purpose of this is to deliver this messaging rather than just enjoy the musings of a person who was once famous in a political context for an apolitical act.
That's a really nice way of putting it, Scott. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. I'm hoping not to do too much editing on this segment, so let's keep it that way. Right.
So let's return to the printed piece, which I think will help steer us clear of trouble there. And the first one was that just truly leapt off the page. That's what generated my saying, like, you've got to be kidding me, which is this idea that persons who are approved for running for president have to be pass some background check first. Now, she doesn't say who will be the person approving or disproving of that, but I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to wildly speculate now, Mark, that perhaps the Biden administration would say that Mr. Trump, for instance, I was just going to pick a name out of a hat, did
just
not
at random,
the requisite background check to be named to the ballot, to be chosen by Americans as president of the United States. And that, maybe they could write in his name. I don't know if that would be allowed under her new amendment. But in any case, the powers that be would be able to say this person's approved for ballot access and this person's not, based on a background check.
Isn't that wonderful? Because you've got so many factors of present government that would need to be involved. First, it'd be deciding what factors would be involved in the background check. Yeah. Second, they'd have to obviously it would have to pass which agency would be doing such a background check, because let's be fair, agencies aren't always great at digging into backgrounds, as we found out with the Justice Brett Kavanaugh going through his confirmation hearing, his nomination hearing.
Mark, you know what sometimes agencies do as well? Sometimes they don't produce their requisite product in a timely fashion. So perhaps the background check, due to unavoidable delays, could not have been processed within the requisite time to get the ballots printed. And whoopsie.
And lo and behold, Joe Biden, age 86, has to run for a third term. It's not his fault. It's just because of the system in place. And he's just, poor Joe, 86 years old, he, running for his, or 90 years old, or 94 years old, running for his 27th term. It's not his fault. He doesn't want to do this to the Constitution. Right. So that was one that
I'm told that his experience is to our great benefit and not and doesn't accrue to infirmity or lack of cognition.
I thought this was no country for old men.
To the American people.
Unless they're Democrats, of course. Okay, so that was one. That was a huge one. I thought that was...
As an aging white man, Mark, I'm delighted to see the big box media turn from hating that demographic to embracing it as wizened leaders.
Well, Scott, it only works if you're socialist.
Well,
which
any port in a storm, Mark.
any port in the storm, right? Yeah.
No,
Well,
I'm
I'll be
kidding,
looking
of
into
course.
this socialism malarkey in about 40 years when I'm in that region myself.
The key thing for socialism is that the leaders don't have to suffer the indignities of the
Well, of
hoi
course,
polloi.
of
Yeah.
course. I mean, it's the hallmark of socialism. Now, so that was one big point on there that I also felt was probably the biggest one. But what else struck your attention?
Mark, the second thing that was the age restriction that she wants to impose. So it's sort of like, okay, we can. To me, the messaging is, okay, here are the things to exclude Trump, and then also we'll do these other things to exclude Biden. And that's the messaging, is that we don't want Biden, but also we don't want Trump. And I just thought it was hilarious because it's like, what other choices can she remove from the American people? Clearly, what she's frustrated with is the American people are choosing people that she doesn't like for their leaders, and so she wants to narrow the choices to within the acceptable bands to get to a pick that she approves of.
Yeah, to get to Gavin Newsom is what she's saying here. It's to get to Gavin Newsom.
You're not supposed to say the quiet part out loud, Mark. Come on.
I know. I mean, for me, there was it was number 5 on her list, which was, and I'm quoting here, "Bye-bye, Electoral College." Now, there's a whole episode of Liberty Nation Radio to be done on the sins and the virtues of the Electoral College. But the idea that, you just remove the voices from all of these other co-equal states in favor of mega cities on the east and west coast. I mean, it's really just the most un-American thing I can think of.
Well, I don't know that I agree that it's un-American. Just because the Electoral College is part of our Constitution, I don't think that most Americans feel like that's part of being an American. I think they feel like it's
but having an equal representation
of our governance.
Having an equal representation is.
Well, the point that they would make is that it's unequal representation, meaning the way that states that are small, and that's actually the way our founders designed it, is that a small state like Rhode Island or Vermont has 2 senators, for instance, and yet a big state like California, also 2 senators. Now, if we were reopening the books and writing anew, I don't think that the people of California would be as cool with that.
Scott, if I may interrupt, I have the solution to this. I have the solution to this whole problem. Is what you should do is you should have a second chamber of government, maybe call it the House of Representatives, and then give a representative based on the population of the state, because
we understand
that way everybody gets the representation that they want at the same time without just ending up with 2 mega cities on either coast. What do you think of that idea? Do you think the founders would go for it?
It's a defensible position to say that the power that the Senate has should be more equally divided by the population and not by the states. We also used to have a feature in this country whereby the states themselves, the state governments, would send senators to the Congress. There was no direct election of the Senate. And so that actually kind of, was another more move towards direct democracy. And let me just add one thing, Mark, about this Electoral College thing is I think there's a factor here that people aren't, I think, featuring in, which is that so many people who live in dominant states where, for instance, in California, if you're a Republican, Mark, I think that a lot of people's expectations will be turned on their head if that comes to fruition, because there are plenty of Californians who stay home instead of going out and voting Republican, for instance.
A point well made. Scott and Ms. Lewinsky, thank you both for your insight. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Mr. Tim Donner and Scott DeCasens, for joining us, and of course extend my thanks to you at home for taking the time to tune in and listen. I've been Mark Angelides. Thanks for listening, and we'll meet again next week. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.